I wish to welcome everybody to today's history class, the first of 5 with Apostle Lachlan Mackay, a very brief history of Community of Christ. I would remind everyone that this session will be recorded, so if you do not wish your image to be shared on the internet, please mute or turn off your camera using the little icon at the bottom right. We're so very pleased to have Apostle Lachlan Mackay with us today. He, as you probably know, was supposed to be our guest ministry at Toronto Reunion this year, but as things happened, that didn't happen. But we're so happy that he's agreed to be part of our e-camping experience, and he's done the tour of Nauvoo with us and the tour of Kirtland, and now he is doing the 5-part history course with us. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Locke.
Great. Claire, you were going to be kind enough to offer an opening prayer for us, I think.
All right. Just bow our heads in. Almighty God, we are always grateful to you for the blessings we receive day by day, whether we deserve them or whether we are entitled to them or not. And now as we gather together virtually and realize that we are so far apart in miles, but that does not affect the way your Spirit will work with us and through us. And so we would ask you to be with our brother Lack, that as he brings the presentation to us, not only today, but for the next 5 sessions, that we will be able to learn and better appreciate and understand some of the history with its trials and tribulations, even some of the mistakes that may have been made, the errors that have been made, the poor judgment maybe that have been made by those in the past. And yet using all of that we use it as a stepping stone and a jumping off point that we might go forward from this day on. And so we'd ask you to be with Brother Lack again as he makes his presentation, and be with each of us who are present to listen and to learn and to share the things that we do learn with those that we come in contact with. And so we'd ask you now to bless each of us in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. So I'd like to start by sharing just a little bit about my story. I was born and raised in Jackson County, Missouri, outside of Independence. On my dad's side of the family, they joined the church in the 1880s in Australia as missionaries were sailing up and down the coast, New South Wales, Australia. My mom's family, pretty early, they joined on April 6th of 1830. So through my mom, I'd be a great, great, great grandson of Joseph and Emma Smith through Joseph III. He had, of course, 17 children, widowed twice, married 3 times, succeeded by 3 of his sons in the presidency of the church. One of them, Frederick Madison Smith, he had 2 daughters, one of whom was my mom's mom. Raised, again, in Jackson County, going to places like Nauvoo and going to Smith family reunions. I got to say, the story of the church never really captured me as a child. It was there. I don't know, just not captured by it. Went away to University of Missouri in Columbia, Missouri. I ended up with Russian studies and economics degrees. And I thought I was going to work for the government, and it was a really long interview process, months and months and months and months. And I needed to kill some time. So I signed up for a museum management program through Graceland University, now Graceland, then Graceland College. And I came to Nauvoo with Alma Blair, that some of you may know of. And before I got here, I thought, I had to learn something about this place that I'm going to spend the summer. And I picked up Robert Bruce Flanders' Kingdom on the Mississippi. And I started reading, and I was soon captured by our story. The history just grabbed me. And I became that annoying kid in class all summer long who would ask lots of questions and keep everybody late. And I ended up being asked to go to Kirtland my second summer. And I had never been there before. But as I got to Kirtland Temple, I walked in, and our tours normally go upstairs first. So we start climbing the second floor, and I'm thinking, boy, this is a great old building. And third floor, and I'm thinking, what wonderful history. And I made it to the lower court, and I was almost knocked over by the power of the Holy Spirit. So as I think I mentioned earlier, although I was baptized at 10, I was converted, I believe, at maybe age 23 as I walked into that space. And I know that God is not limited to any space, can act anywhere in our lives. But for whatever reason, that place for me just is pretty special. It seems like the veil is thinner or something there for me. So I had a number of amazing experiences there. I was asked as the summer ended to stay and become the site director in Kirtland for the first time, full-time paid site director, and then eventually got all Community Crest historic sites. And in maybe 2015, I got an email from President Veazey asking me if I could come down and visit, have a meeting. And I was pretty sure I thought I knew what the meeting was going to be about, and it was. And as we finished, there was a number of people in that meeting. He said, Lach, can you stop by my office? You probably have a few more questions. Nope, I'm good. He said again, no, come on by. And no, I don't have any more questions. He's like, it was clearly not a request anymore. It was an order. So Steve is, like me, pretty introverted, not big on small talk. And so I sat down, and he immediately launched into an invitation to consider joining the Council of 12. And I immediately went into this kind of out-of-body experience. And I immediately said, without any thought, well, why would I want to do that? I'm a terrible administrator, and I hate meetings. And Steve tried to convince me that there weren't that many meetings. He has since apologized. Now, out of fairness to Steve, at that time, we were going to be doing something different. And rather than being an administrator, I was going to be teaching and speaking for the most part. And there would be other people that would be doing a lot of the administrative stuff. That lasted about 2 months. Didn't quite work out that way. But so ordained into the Council of 12, 2016, Steve was very clear that he was inviting me into that role because he wanted to reconnect the past with the present and the future. And so whenever I get the chance, I try and do that. And hopefully we'll begin to be doing that this week a little bit. As we move forward, I would invite you at any point, if you have questions, just jump right in. Now I can only see 4 of you on the screen, actually 3 of you on the screen. So feel free simply to interrupt. We'll see how it goes, and we'll come up with a different system if that doesn't work. But at any point, questions are welcome and appreciated. Any questions as I move to share my screen? Let's start with a Doctrine and Covenants section 162.2a. Almost every time I talk about church history, this is where I start. Listen carefully to your own journey as a people, for it is a sacred journey, and it has taught you many things you must know for the journey yet to come. Listen to its teachings and discover anew its principles. Do not yearn for times that are past, but recognize that you have been given a foundation of faithful service, even as you build a foundation for what is yet to be. Listen carefully to your own journey as a people. Context, critically important. Whenever we talk church history, I think it's really important to do so in the context of what was happening around us. So a little bit of context. The Smith family were seekers. You see here a daguerreotype. I believe this is a photograph of a daguerreotype anyway, of Lucy Mack Smith. This is the first known photo of Lucy, something I found in Lynn and Lorene Smith's attic in the 1990s, and worked with Ron Romig, our church archivist, then to establish that as an image of Lucy. And then you see a painting of Joseph Smith Sr. So when I say seekers, what I mean by that is that there was a movement in the early 19th century of people who deeply believed the Christian message, and they desperately wanted to find a restoration of the primitive Christian church, but they were not part of any organized religion. So they were seeking the primitive Christian church, again, not part of any particular faith, and particularly Joseph Smith Sr., a seeker. So Joseph Jr. would have been raised in that home with that environment. Also, Joseph would have been raised in what was called the Burned Over District. It's part of upstate New York, and it was called the Burned Over District because the fires of religious revivalism kept sweeping through. So lots and lots of religious revivals around a young Joseph Smith Jr. Now, more recently, scholars have concluded that yes, there were lots and lots of revivals in this part of upstate New York, but it turns out there were probably lots and lots of revivals all over the states at the time. I'm intrigued. I don't know enough about Canadian history to know if it crept across the border. It wouldn't surprise me. But lots of questions about faith and belief at this point in time, and Joseph being raised in that environment. And this particular part of New York generated a number of new religious movements as a result. A reminder that we get our start as communitarians, meaning we are people who believe that living and working in community is a better system than living and working alone. When you flip through the early Doctrine and Covenants sections, you will see again and again a focus on being one. And when it says that, it means one economically, meaning sharing resources. And we had all kinds of methods set up. You weren't required to, where you could pool resources so that the surplus of the wealthy could lift up the poor. And this communitarian idea was not confined to us. There were lots and lots of different expressions early on. You see harmonists at Economy, Pennsylvania, in the fields, top left. They were German separatists. And the very first German Latter-day Saints are probably harmonists first. Before leaving, they were teaching celibacy, and that didn't play well with some members of the community, so they split, and some of those people become Latter-day Saints. Then you see the Shakers, bottom right in this image, another communitarian group in the 19th century. I know you have Doukhobors in parts of Canada, another communitarian group. I think they may be a little later by the time they get to Alberta and then on into BC. This idea of communitarianism, really important early on. Harmonists, Shakers, the Oneida colonies in upstate New York. You might have Oneida silverware in your drawers at home. Lots and lots of different expressions of this. We also, like many others at the time of these groups, were utopians. We had this dream of building a perfect society, which of course we called Zion. No poor and no war. There were others with similar dreams. So for example, you see a sketch of the Icarian community. The Icarians are French utopians that moved into Nauvoo as the Latter-day Saints are driven out. So what that structure in the center, kind of funny looking structure in the center, is actually the facade of the Nauvoo temple after it had been burned and after a storm hit and knocked down most of the walls. So the Icarians take what was our temple square in the heart of Nauvoo and turn it into the center of their community. That school building on the left is built of temple stone. So our Zion, they called Icaria, just one of many expressions of these utopian groups, these people trying to build a perfect society. And finally, we, like others at the time, were Christian primitivists. Another way to say that is restorationists. There were significant numbers of groups of people who were desperately trying to restore what they understood of the primitive Christian church. You see folks like William Miller, who out of his experience grew the Seventh-day Adventist movement. You see Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell, the Stone-Campbell movement. Today, the Disciples of Christ and the Churches of Christ in the US anyway. Sidney Rigdon was working with Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone when he bumped into Latter-day Saint missionaries. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. And he eventually defects and brings lots of his followers with them. So as a result, there's really interesting intellectual crossover between the church that is going to become the disciples of Christ and us. Some historians argue that we should be called the Smith-Rigdon movement because of the impact of Sidney Rigdon as he joined with Joseph Smith and brought some of these thought processes with him. There are some significant differences between, of course, Latter-day Saints and the disciples of Christ, primarily having to do with continuing revelation. Later disciples leaders would say, where the Bible speaks, we speak. Where the Bible is silent, we are silent. So they turn to the Bible only for authority. And of course, for Latter-day Saints, we would have angelic authority and revelatory authority. So we are communitarians, utopians, and Christian primitivists at our beginning. Let's start in upstate New York, where the church is organized. So this is being celebrated by some in our tradition as the 200th anniversary of Joseph Smith's first vision. I'm not so sure. We don't know exactly what year Joseph had this experience in. I kind of lean to 2024, but some historians think it's 2020. And so there's been a lot of activity, particularly in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commemorating the bicentennial of Joseph Smith's first vision. Now, I think this was an important event in the life of Joseph, but this was not the foundational event for the church. We made it that later, but it was not. So let me back up and say that Joseph's oldest brother, Alvin, had been the glue that held the Smith family together. He was critically important in the life of the family, but he got sick and a doctor was called who gave him medicine that had mercury in it. It was a not uncommon treatment at the time, but it killed Alvin. And the family, as you can imagine, is deeply distraught. They are devastated by the loss of the oldest child in the family. Lucy and some of the kids had been considering a particular church. Joseph Sr. was still not so sure, but Lucy and some of the kids are attending a particular church. At Alvin's funeral, the minister suggests that Alvin is going to burn eternally because he had never been baptized into any faith. As you can imagine, that was not a comfort to the family. And so religion, which you would hope might bring families together, was tearing the Smith family apart. And that is the context in which a young Joseph Smith Jr. goes in prayer into a grove of trees. We don't know exactly where. You can go to Palmyra, and there's a beautiful grove where you can go and remember this event, but we don't know exactly where it was. Joseph had an amazing theophany, this incredible spiritual experience, which was not uncommon at the time. There are other people at this time and in this area who are having these kinds of experiences and leaving records of them, some of them really quite similar to Joseph's experience. What this was Joseph's conversion experience. He looked back, and he's told his sins are forgiven. He looks back on this experience and says, "My soul was filled with love, and for many days I could rejoice with great joy, and the Lord was with me." So this amazing experience that brought what we today might call the peace of Jesus Christ into Joseph's life. Now, I'm sharing with you the 1832 account at the moment. He sees one personage, and it seems to be Jesus, because the personage says, "I was crucified for you." Now, although it seems to be Jesus, Joseph was Trinitarian at this time, so the three are one. So I guess it could be God. Jesus is God. I don't know. But this is the 1832 account. As you probably know, Joseph would end up leaving a number of accounts of this experience. And as his understanding of the nature of God evolves, his understanding of this experience evolves. And so by the later 1830s, Joseph starts to understand that there is God the Father and God the Son and God the Holy Spirit, and that they are separate, distinct beings. So he's moving away from Trinitarian thought, and his accounts of the first vision reflect that. So eventually, by 1838, we get an account. Now, the 1832 account is the only one in Joseph's handwriting, but by 1838, he leaves one where there's two personages, and God the Father says, "This is my beloved Son, hear him." You've probably seen images of it where they're identical looking personages in this experience. For years, eventually, now, the first vision was not something that people knew about, or very few knew about it in the 1830s and 40s. It was simply not really part of the life of the church. It was Joseph's personal experience. It's mentioned a few times, but not publicly talked about for the most part. Eventually, though, after Joseph's death, long after, we end up in a place where we start converting people on Joseph's personal conversion experience. And our cousins in the Church of Jesus Christ do the same thing. And eventually, anti-Mormons come along and start pulling out different accounts with different details. And it could be devastating to somebody who had no conversion experience of their own, but was just relying on Joseph's experience. So in more recent years, at our historic sites, for example, we have pulled back from focusing on the 1838 account. And as historians, because we often think the earlier account is probably going to be more accurate, not always, but often. When we talk about this experience, we talk about it now, again, as Joseph's personal conversion experience. And typically, he had an experience with Jesus, is how we would interpret it today. So what does the first vision mean for us today, if anything? So here's what it means for me. I had a chance to visit Palmyra, New York, and I've been there many times, but a number of years back, I was there with Andrew Bolton and with Esther and Rosemary, who were in the World Service Corps, a program where people from North America go international to engage in the life of the church. And some of our international members would come to the US, and they would serve at historic sites in Kirtland and Nauvoo, as well as at times in Independence. So while Esther and Rosemary were in Kirtland, we took a field trip to Palmyra. Now, they were African grandmothers. And I got to say, I was a little nervous at the time because the conventional wisdom was our mostly white, North American, 19th century, mostly male story isn't going to speak to our international members. A lot of people seemed to think that at the time. And I was starting to wonder myself. I got to say that my experience has been the exact opposite. Our national members, especially from the developing world, are more quick to capture the story, to be captured by it, than many of us are, because they are often still living the story of poverty and persecution and 8-hour-long worship services. They get it and they connect to it pretty quickly. And as we wandered through the sacred grove with Rosemary and Esther, it was raining. They had these beautifully, brilliantly colored dresses on, and these wonderful umbrellas that are brightly patterned. I just remember how beautiful it was, the greens and the skin tones and the brilliant colors. As we left, we started to talk a little bit as we sat in the car in the parking lot. And I asked them what, if anything, this meant to them. And they shared that what they got out of it was that if God cared for a poor, illiterate farm boy, then maybe God cared for a poor African grandmother. Now, at some level, that was heartbreaking that they wouldn't already know that God cares for all. I came away with this profound sense that what the first vision says to me today is that all are of worth in the eyes of God. It's a worth of persons event. And I think it's also reinforces another enduring principle, the idea that all are called. God chose to work through a 14-year-old boy in upstate New York. All are called. And I think there are plenty of other legitimate interpretations, but for me, those are some of the things that the first vision means today. Book of Mormon. You see the Hill Cumorah in a 19th century engraving. Hill Cumorah, of course, is a drumlin, meaning it was shaped by glaciers that carved these long hills running north-south in that part of the country. So Joseph began translating the Book of Mormon, and he loaned, apparently, a big chunk of the manuscript to Martin Harris, who was going to fund the publication of the manuscript. And we're not sure what happened, but it seems like Martin Harris's wife might well have been upset that Martin was going to be involved financially with this. We're not sure what happened, but eventually the manuscript disappears from the Harris family. So Joseph has to start over. And when he starts over, so he's using Urim and Thummim, but when he starts over, he's using a seer stone. You see a seer stone that was apparently Joseph's in the photo on the right, the little egg-shaped device. So Joseph was part of this magic world view in the 19th century in upstate New York that believed that people could find lost items. There was a belief that a pirate had buried gold or silver, actually silver, somewhere in upstate New York. Lots of people looking for that. This sounds really puzzling to us today. It doesn't make a lot of sense in our culture, in our context, but it's kind of like people today who might have a lucky rabbit's foot, or maybe a better example, people who believe that divining for water works. Now, intellectually, I know that does not work, but emotionally, I think I've seen it work. We had somebody who came out and helped us figure out where to drill a well, and they found the septic tank lines and the cistern and all kinds of stuff that made it seem like it worked. It was a little puzzling. So it's puzzling to us today. I've heard some people say, yeah, it's also silly to think that you could read through silica, through sand, through glass. I don't know. So the result of Joseph's work is the Book of Mormon, and it was the miracle. It was the foundational event of the church, what they understood to be a history of the inhabitants of ancient America. Questions?
Hi, Catherine here. I'm
Hello.
really new to the history here, so I put in the chat. So is this translation of the Book of Mormon like a second vision? The first vision being the meeting of Christ, the conversion, and then the second vision is finding the tablets? I've missed something here in the history.
So I don't know that I would, so he did have a number of visions of Moroni, although sometimes it refers to Nephi, that kind of led up to the publication of the Book of Mormon. So, but I wouldn't say that, well, some people would say that the resulting text came to him through some kind of a visionary experience. I don't know that we really know how it worked. So some understand that he translated gold plates that had inscribed on them a history of the people of ancient America. And there was a huge amount of interest in where Native Americans came from. Where did these people come from? And part of that interest was that there were huge earthen mounds and earthworks surrounding Joseph and in Ohio and even here in Illinois. So they were trying to make sense of where did these Native Americans come from? And there's clearly evidence of ancient civilizations surrounding us that these people must have been responsible for, maybe. So what Joseph understood, and others argued at the time as well, is that Native Americans were of Hebrew origin, and the Book of Mormon is that story. Some people understand it to be a literal history of some or all of the Native Americans. Other people understand it to be a 19th century text that's trying to make sense of the religious controversies of the day. You'll find both positions in Community of Christ members today. That help at all? David? Anybody else? Questions? I think Dale Luffman's book is really helpful in understanding the Book of Mormon. I think that there's some new resources that are coming out that look at the Book of Mormon through kind of a social justice lens that are really helpful as well. That can, I think in many cases, Community of Christ members have either never learned or have forgotten how to use the Book of Mormon as scripture. And I think there are helpful tools that we can use to make sense of it. I don't think I find it helpful to get lost in debates about historicity, meaning is it history or not? We spent a lot of time on those debates in earlier years, but I don't know that that's particularly helpful. I'm interested in what does the book have to say that can help us lead more Christ-like lives and help others do the same. Other questions? Pretty quiet group. Starting to worry that most of you are frozen.
I think you've got a very experienced group of people on this. I'm one of the newbies.
All right, we'll keep pushing forward.
Locke, you may just want to mention that Dale's book is called The Book of Mormon's Witness to its First Readers, in case people aren't familiar with it.
So I wonder if there's somebody talented enough to drop a link into the chat. where people could actually find it at Herald House. So the Book of Mormon is published, and out of that eventually grows the organization of a church. April 6th of 1830, apparently it took 6 members to officially organize. There's a big debate. We all think that it happened in Fayette, New York, at the Whitmer Farm, the picture you see on the left. There's actually decent evidence that it happened in Manchester, New York. So it's a little puzzling, but the township line between Palmyra Township and Manchester Township ran through the Smith farm. And so depending on what side of the line you're on, you might be in Palmyra, you might be in Manchester. But there's decent evidence to suggest that that organizational conference actually happened in Manchester, New York, April 6th of 1830, and that those earliest baptisms took place perhaps in the creek that you see here that would have been dammed up. But wherever it took place, the church is organized April 6th of 1830. And almost immediately, they are sending missionaries to preach to Native Americans, again, that they understood to be Lamanites. They saw God at work in gathering Native people to what is now the US state of Kansas. So rather than the missionaries having to travel all over to find these people, the government was gathering them in one spot. So we sent missionaries out to what is now Kansas to preach to these people. They got there, and they had stopped in Kirtland first, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But they did eventually get there. It was a terrible winter. They're walking through snow waist deep. It's just an awful trip. They get there, they start preaching, and they discover that there were other missionaries from other churches that were there first. And not surprisingly, they were protective of their flocks. So they said to our missionaries, well, wait a minute, where's your permit? What do you mean permit? Well, it turns out we were supposed to stop in St. Louis, Missouri and get a permit from the Indian agent to even be out there. So the missionaries backed up to Jackson County, Missouri. Some started preaching while others went back to St. Louis to try and get that permit. I don't know that they ever got it, but they had some missionary success in Jackson County, Missouri. And in the meantime, there was significant activity in the Kirtland, Ohio area. And soon those members from New York would start moving either to Jackson County, Missouri or Kirtland, Ohio. That gets us to Kirtland, 1831 to 1838. Again, a reminder that we are Christian primitivists. So as we land in Kirtland, Ohio, we go about attempting to restore or physically recreate what we understood of New Testament Christianity. And the best written description we had of what the early church looked like comes from the book of Acts. So as Andrew Bolton has helpfully pointed out, the book of Acts is our template. It's almost like our instruction manual for what we were trying to do in 1830s Kirtland. Some examples of that from Acts chapter 2, verse 1. When the day of Pentecost was fully come, they were all with one accord in one place. So believers were gathered together. Joseph restates that in the Doctrine and Covenants, section 37. And again, a commandment I give unto the church, that it is expedient in me that they should assemble together at the Ohio. So from very early, we have this important concept that if you joined us, you probably packed your family up and moved to one of our gathered communities. Now, eventually we realized that that meant the most passionate and dedicated members were moving away. So it made it hard to keep the church thriving in other places. But at the time, people were gathering to central communities initially in Kirtland. Other influence, trying to live a variation on all things common that we touched on a little earlier. It's from Acts chapter 2, verse 44, and all that believe were together and had all things common. You can find from the Book of Commandments, which was the forerunner to the Doctrine and Covenants. And behold, thou shalt consecrate all thy properties, that which thou hast unto me, with a covenant and a deed which cannot be broken. So again, if you joined us, you were invited, you weren't required, but invited to give your property to the church. They would give back to you what you needed for your just wants and needs, and then the surplus would be distributed to those in need. Why all things common? It was our concern for the plight of the poor. So from Acts chapter 2, verse 45, they sold their possessions and goods and parted them to all men as every man had need. That's restated in the Doctrine and Covenants, section 42. And behold, thou wilt remember the poor and consecrate of thy properties for their support. And inasmuch as ye impart of your substance unto the poor, ye will do it unto me. Yet more Acts influence is our passion for proclaiming the gospel to the rest of the world. So from Acts chapter 1, verse 8, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. That's Jesus talking to his disciples, telling them to tarry in Jerusalem until they were endowed with power from on high. In 1831, in Kirtland, Ohio, at a place called the Isaac Morley Farm, Joseph prophesied that the church would grow to cover the entire world. Years ago, I was reading an article about archaeology in Antarctica. And the way you do that is to wait for the summer, and the ice melts in these scientific research stations, and artifacts float to the surface. They had a picture in this article of some of the things floating to the surface. One of them was a little brochure, a little tract. Joseph Smith tells his own story. Somehow it made it all the way to Antarctica. So the church covering the entire world. So why had we landed in Kirtland? What was the significance of that place? So remember, I talked about those missionaries that were passing through from New York on the way to what is now Kansas. One of those missionaries was a man named Parley P. Pratt. He had been a Rigdonite, a member of one of 17 congregations in northeastern Ohio under the direction of Sidney Rigdon. Remember, Sidney worked with Alexander Campbell and Walter Scott and Barton Stone in the development of what was going to become the Disciples of Christ movement. But eventually he split. He liked what Parley had to share with him when he came through on this mission. And he and many of his congregations convert in mass. I don't know that they had buildings. Well, in some cases they did, but it was almost like just changing the sign on the front of the building. So huge conversions by these missionaries in 1830 in the Kirtland, Ohio area. This was critically important in the life of the church. I don't know that as an organization we would have survived had it not been for the impact of this mission. Just as important as how many people converted were who they were. It was the who's who of the early church. People like Frederick Granger Williams, who would later become a member of the First Presidency, Edward Partridge, who would later become a member of the presiding bishopric, N.K. Whitney, who would become the bishop of the Ohio Church, Lyman White and Orson Hyde, who would become apostles, Isaac Morley, a member of the bishopric, and others. So again, I can't overstate the importance of the people converted by, from Sidney Rigdon's flock by these early missionaries. So let me back up and let me stop again any questions? And again, if they're coming in on the chat, I can't really see them. Any questions?
Look, it was common for a whole church to convert together.
Well, in this case, it was happening anyway. And I think it probably was probably more common then than now. And if you think about it, churches then and even now are often family-based, kind of extended family often. So people often would move en masse. I don't want to overstate that, but kind of. So even when Charles Neff and others took the church into Odisha, India, I was listening to David Howlett the other night lecture about the church going into India. And it was an example where this was happening, and even more so in the Philippines. Most of our churches today in the Philippines were part of these mass conversions of congregations coming from a kind of an evangelical small church that were also in some ways restorationists. So they had
Sorry,
something.
I was on that call as well, like that session.
Yeah.
And I thought that that was so interesting that they just, basically changed the sign.
Yeah, yeah. I think, again, because they're often extended families or in some cases kind of the village church. I don't think it happens as much today in North America anyway. Having said that, I think there are examples where there is discussion about entire congregations becoming Community of Christ, but it's more complex today. Other questions? Okay, so why a temple? We land in Kirtland, and fairly quickly we start building what becomes Kirtland Temple. So that's rooted in our Christian primitivist past. From Acts chapter 2, verse 46, day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple. You see the same in Luke chapter 24, and they were continually in the temple blessing God. So this is so early in Christian history, of course, that the people are still Jewish. The temple still played a role in the life of the church. But because these passages are our template, temples would be important for us as well. Remember that in Jackson County, Missouri, we soon were moving from planning one temple to 24 temples. There was going to be this whole complex, and they were going to be not just places to worship, but schools to educate our children, and storehouses to store food for the poor, and print shops to print church scriptures. Basically, our concept of what was sacred and what was worthy of being housed in a sacred place in the temple was really broad. It's kind of an early expression of the sacredness of creation. It's all sacred, so all worthy of being in a temple. 24 temples planned for Jackson County, 3 what we called at the time houses of the Lord, which really means temple, planned for Kirtland, Ohio. So if you read section 91 of the Doctrine and Covenants, it talks about these 2 other buildings we hope to build in Kirtland, and it uses the temple as a point of reference. So on the tour the other day, we talked about how they were planning not just one of those buildings, but 3, and again, planning 24 temples in Independence, Missouri.
Okay, I have a question about that.
Okay.
Well, actually, I have 2 questions. The first question, in the very early days of the early church, was there an actual different understanding of house of the Lord versus temple, seeing as, they planned 24 temples and then 3 houses of the Lord? I know that we came to just call them temples, but was there initially a different understanding?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I've wondered that myself, and I'm not quite sure. I think the root of temple means house of the Lord, but for whatever reason, when they talk about independence, they talk about temples. When they talk about Kirtland, they talk about houses of the Lord. So it does seem like there's some distinction early on, but by 1835, in the Council of 12 Minutes in Kirtland, they're using them interchangeably. They're also using, though, the stone chapel is a term they often used for the Kirtland Temple, the stone chapel. So I think there is a difference, David, but I don't know what it is.
Sure. Fair enough. Okay.
Yeah.
And the other question I had, so if we look at the Bible, you know, throughout the entire Old Testament and New Testament, as far as I know, the Jews and then the early Christians, who, of course, as you mentioned, were still, of course, Jewish, had only one temple. I know that there were different temples, but because they each were destroyed and were rebuilt, but I think that they only ever had one at a time. And I know in the Book of Mormon, Nephi is also told or decides, I can't remember which, to build a temple. But again, he just builds one. So, you know, looking at this, and I've heard, of course, many times about this plan for Missouri, the 24. What were the early church people, the early church leaders, what were they thinking? I mean, I know you touched on they wanted it more for just worship, you know, schools and such, but to actually call them temples versus any other kind of name like a school,
Yeah.
like 24 temples, what was the intention there? That just strikes me as really not in sync with the scriptures that they had at the time.
Yeah, I think, and this is just speculation on my part, but it really was rooted in the we are God's people, and we are recreating the New Jerusalem, and we are sanctifying this land. I think it's all just kind of an expression of this desire to make sacred everything around them. But I don't think that I have a good answer for that. I don't think it's the only time, though, that we are inspired by things. Well, it's not just them, even today, inspired by things in the Bible that we then run with, and might not resemble what we started with.
Right.
I think that would be a great topic for you to do some more research on and see what you can find out for us.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Other questions?
Locke, do you think that it was really theologically driven, or was it more a identity, credibility building exercise to build a temple?
I don't know, and it clearly wasn't driven by economics, because even though we planned all these buildings, very quickly we realized there's no way we can do this. And for example, when you read section 91 in manuscript form, so before it's printed in the Doctrine and Covenants, it says, build these 2 other buildings. So there's going to be a total of 3. But by the time it's printed in the Doctrine and Covenants in 1835, it's changed. It says, don't build these until I get back with you, basically, until the Lord provides more instruction. They quickly realized that they were barely going to get 1 put up, let alone 3. And you know, in Independence, they weren't even able to do the 1. Yeah, I don't know. Fun to ponder. What else? Okay, we talked about on the tour the other day, tabernacle and temple language. The temple has inner courts and outer courts, has veils initially. Again, these are not the originals, but give you an idea of what these heavy canvas partitions might have looked like, simply room dividers in the 1830s. We also wanted to build a temple because we needed a place to educate our members and leaders. Section 85, the Doctrine and Covenants, seek ye out of the best books words of wisdom, seek learning even by study and also by faith. We also didn't have enough money to pay rent on the place that we were renting to worship. So we needed a place to gather and worship. We needed a place to educate our ministers. As we discussed on Saturday, that's why we ended up with 2 large, almost identical rooms, one on top of the other. One is to worship, one is for school. The temple was also supposed to be a house of order, meaning a place of church administration, an office building. And that's what happened on the 3rd floor of the temple. Administrative quorums met up there in the evenings. The church starts with a really simple structure. We had a first elder in 1830, that's Joseph, a second elder, that's Oliver Cowdery. Then we had 3 priesthoods, elders, priests, or teachers, 3 priesthood offices. But look how complex it's gotten just by 1835. We've moved to a first presidency. We had a presiding patriarch, kind of a father figure to the church. We had Missouri presidents. We have high councils or judicial bodies in Kirtland and in Zion or Missouri. We have apostles who are missionaries. We have 70s who support the apostles and missionaries. And then financial leaders like the Missouri bishopric or the Kirtland bishop. So we started to get a pretty complex organizational structure not long after we were organized. Temple was also to be a house of learning. We talked about this a little bit. So things like the School of the Apostles, which meant missionary training, the School of the Elders, the Kirtland High School that met on the 3rd floor with students ranging in age from 6 through adults. Rats, 1258. We're just getting started. Let's wrap up there. Questions as we finish?
Locke, has there been much said about why so many different levels of governance? Because that would have also.
I don't know.
Is it because you're spreading out in your small rural communities, or?
I think we were growing quickly and we were trying to replicate what we thought the early church administrative structure looked like. So I think it's a combination of those 2 things, probably. But
so as we're looking forward now into the future community of Christ, it's trying to peel back the layers. And is there a way to reduce and go back to the simpler way of doing things?
I think we're going to have to. I think we're going to have to. So yes, I think we're going to end up with far less structure. I think it'll be much simpler. I think it'll be less hierarchical. So I do think that those are areas that we can learn from in the early church.
So we're going through this Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. So a lot of it is the colonialism and the impact of the European court systems and systems on what's happening. And I'm wondering, I think you see some of that reflected within the church hierarchy, trying to keep that control.
And why do we have church presidents and the presidency? That's not biblical.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've long been intrigued by that. Yeah, I think you're onto something.
Locke, I remember on Saturday you were talking about this week that you were going to hopefully help us learn from our history lessons into the future, because we're in the middle of the pandemic and we have time to think about these things. So I'm really pleased with each structure that you go through, that you relate it to what's going on today and on into the future with the church. So you're our liaison.
Well, with your help, we'll keep doing it for the rest of the week.
To help doing that. I see development in third world countries, and they don't have anything near a temple. They have a tent set up, but they build schools sometimes. And somehow that simple way of developing congregations and communities seems to take away from the complexness of what we go through. So
I skipped over it, but one of the reasons we were building the temple in Kirtland is that I guess I did talk about it Saturday, we desperately wanted a place to educate our children to break the cycle of poverty that so many were trapped in. So this belief that if they could read and write, they could take care of themselves. I think that's part of it, but we really didn't need that beautiful, expensive building to do that in. But that was probably important in our formative years. If you have questions that we didn't cover, feel free to email me, lmackay@seaofchrist.org, and I will start tomorrow by trying to address those. I appreciate the questions, and feel free to do more of that tomorrow, and we'll see where we get up to by then. Thank you so very much. See everybody tomorrow.
Thanks very much, Locke. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.